Hi everyone, should we start? Hi everyone, I hope you all are well. My name is Brynjar Wiersholm. I'm the Deputy Director General at the IDI Global Foundations Unit. I'd like to welcome you all, heads and staff of SAIs, development partners, and international finance institutions to this 5th INTOSAI-Donor Cooperation session on responsive SAIs, auditing of emergency funds during the COVID-19 pandemic. IDI's recent engagement with the IMF began in May 2020. We had a message from the INTOSAI General Secretariat that a man by the name of Sebastian Pompey had contacted them about the work of SAIs and how that could be useful as an instrument to address possible misuse of COVID-19 emergency funding, and also that the audit of SAIs was increasingly being included in the underlying agreements for emergency financing. He noted that the IMF was considering a capacity development program to enhance the capacity of SAIs in countries receiving emergency finance. Clearly, this was of interest to the IDI, and we set up a call to understand this more. Our previous engagement with the IMF was that they were largely interested in issues on causing macro fiscal risks and leaving the work with SAIs to their colleagues across the road at the World Bank. It became clear quickly to us that the growing pandemic had fundamentally changed the situation at the IMF and their perspective on SAIs. So what began as an exploratory call had by the end of the week led to IDI recognizing that the IMF was a seriously important and influential player, not just in providing emergency financing, but in working with and strengthening the role of SAIs in this crisis. But we also discovered that the IMF is very different to other IDI partners, such as the World Bank, and that we need to learn how to work with them effectively. Well, I don't know if we yet can claim to be experts in working with the IMF, but we've certainly learned a lot in the past 16 months. We've seen clearly that SAIs and IMF have many shared objectives, and that better mutual understanding and cooperation between SAIs and IMF can bring huge benefits for everyone. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Camilla Fredriksson from our GFU unit to lead us through the first of the two sessions today. Over to you, Camilla.
Thank you, Brynjar, and thank you for that introduction, and also welcome to all our participants today, panelists and participants alike. We will have a 2-hour session today, and in that event we will divide it into 2 different sessions. So in session 1, we will be talking about the role of SAIs in auditing emergency funding as a response to the COVID-19 pandemics. And next, in the session 2, we will be talking about capacity development of SAIs in relation to auditing emergency funding. So for the first session, we'll have presentations followed by a moderated discussion. And I see no reason for waiting anymore, and I will be happy to introduce our speakers. First, we will have a presentation from Emmanuel Matthias, who is the Deputy Unit Chief of the Legal Department in the IMF. He's overseeing the fund's work on anti-corruption and rule of law. And then next, we'll have a presentation from Martin Aldcroft, who will be talking about the role of SAIs, independence and responsiveness to emerging trends. So I think I will just hand over first to Emmanuel. Very welcome, Emmanuel. You'll be talking about IMF emergency financing, governance vulnerabilities, and the role of safeguards, including SAI audits. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Emmanuel Matthias. On behalf of my colleagues from the IMF, I want to thank IDI and INTOSAI for organizing this event and for giving me the opportunities to speak to this important group. I look forward to the discussion and to listening and learning from you more about the experience of auditing emergency financing and how the IMF can support your essential work. In the short time available to me, I would like to provide a brief overview of how the IMF has responded to the unprecedented emergency brought by the COVID pandemic. I will end my presentation by speaking about the importance we place on the essential role of independent supreme audit agencies in the COVID response and the steps are taking to support your work. Let me start with some background about the IMF, since I am aware that many of you may have limited interaction with us. The International Monetary Fund was established at the end of World War II, at the same time as the World Bank. It was created with the primary purpose of assisting in creating a stable international financial system. Since a functional international financial system was understood to be critical for global economic stability, growth, and peace. The founders intended the IMF's role in enabling the global community to rely upon stability in international finance to complement the World Bank's role in post-war global reconstruction. IMF currently has 190 member countries, with the 190th, Andorra, joining last year. The IMF performs its global financial stability function in three primary ways. First, it undertakes yearly reviews of the economic situation in its member countries to identify potential risks to stability and highlight positive developments. Second, upon request, the IMF provides financing to countries to address balance of payment issues. IMF lending aims to give countries breathing room to implement adjustment policies in an orderly manner, which will restore conditions for a stable economy and sustainable growth. Third, the IMF provides capacity development support to contribute to establishing organizational and individual competencies and capabilities needed to design and implement new policies, laws, and practices. For today's discussion, it is important to highlight that the IMF does not finance projects such as building roads or schools. IMF financing is provided to a central bank and can be transferred into the government budget. In case IMF financing is used to support the budget, there is no distinct IMF financing within the government budget to audit. This arrangement distinguishes the IMF from other international financial institutions and development partners. For this reason, IMF-supported programs do not come with specific procurement or financial management rules that relate only to IMF funds. I will return to this point in my discussion of the audit of COVID-related spending, but it is a very important point to understand. With that background in mind, let me jump from the founding of the IMF to the present day. Unfortunately, as we all know, the spread of COVID-19 has caused tremendous losses in human life across the globe. The pandemic has generated an international public health crisis as well as an international social crisis. Countries have been under enormous stress as they try to handle multiple crises at a time when public revenues have dropped. It has been essential for international organizations to step up the challenge of helping countries in their time of need. The IMF has worked hard to ensure that public response to the emergency has not been hampered by short-term financing problems. It provided 87 countries over 160 billion US dollars in emergency financing since mid-2020. This level of financing is unprecedented in the history of the IMF. While engaging in emergency lending, the IMF maintains its commitment to address governance and corruption vulnerabilities in member countries. We have been working to balance the need for immediate COVID-19 financing against appropriate accountability and transparency to ensure as best as possible that financial help reaches those in need. The overall philosophy has been to encourage countries to spend what they need, but to keep the receipts. In many cases, that philosophy was reflected in commitments countries made in their financing agreements to undertake emergency spending in a transparent and accountable manner, with a view of mitigating risks of corruption and fraud. In particular, in most cases, the letter of intent that accompanied the emergency financing cases included provisions relating to regular publication of information on emergency spending, the publication of procurement contracts, and the publication of information on who owned the companies awarded state contracts. Most importantly for our discussion today, in over 50 cases, the letter of intent included a commitment to publishing the results of an independent audit of emergency financing. I would like to stress 2 points regarding the transparency and accountability commitments in the emergency financing commitments. First, they break new ground for the IMF. IMF-supported programs have increasingly featured public financial management issues and action to enhance transparency in procurement and strengthen the independence of supreme audit institutions. The scale and scope of the transparency and accountability commitments are new and partially reflect the unique corruption risk associated with large-scale spending in response to an ongoing emergency. This is just to say that this situation is as new to us as to many of you. Second, the IMF is dedicated to following up on the commitments that have been made, given the importance of having emergency spending undertaken transparently and accountably. IMF followed up included established capacity development projects to support countries in increasing transparency in spending and public procurement, and to support countries in undertaking, publishing, and following up on audits of COVID spending. Our support for audits is financed by a generous contribution from the government of Germany and is undertaken in close collaboration with INTOSAI and IDI. I will not say more about this project right now, since my colleague Sebastian Pompe will have the chance to explain the elements of the project during the second session. In some cases, countries have agreed to make additional progress in implementing transparency and accountability measures as a prior action to receiving additional financing from the IMF. Commitment to these sets of measures is followed up at the level of the IMF board. At its request, we presented to the board a progress report in March of this year. We have been asked to present a second progress report in the coming months. You can get information on the full range of commitments made in emergency financing agreements and the progress that has been made towards these actions on the IMF website. For now, I want to express our recognition of the extraordinary work that has been produced by independent supreme audit institutions in auditing emergency spending. Facing extreme challenges on their own, audit agencies have repeatedly produced reports of the highest standards. The public attention that these reports have generated in countries like Cameroon, Ecuador, Jamaica, Mali, Malawi, Sierra Leone, and South Africa, to name just a few, demonstrate the critical importance of supreme audit institutions in accountability and the reliance the public places on you. We can only salute your efforts, your dedication, and your hard work. There is still much to do. Unfortunately, the pandemic is still with us, and the challenges of how to best respond to the crisis remains. It is clear that while the specific elements of an effective response vary country by country, the need for transparency and accountability in the response is common to all. Meeting the challenge ahead requires us to learn from the experience to date. With deep respect for your independence and sovereignty, and appreciation for your vital role, we at the IMF look forward to listening to you today and to supporting your efforts going forward in the auditing of emergency spending. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I'm sure that many of our participants found it highly enlightening to hear about the basis for the IMF and also how you've been going into this process working more closely with SAIs. And I think we'll be discussing that more in the moderated discussion coming up next. But in the meantime, thank you so much. And now I'll go on to the next presenter, who is Martin Allcroft, who is a strategic support, strategic advice supporter manager in IDI. And he has been working with IDI for a number of years. Before entering into the SSU, the Strategic Support Unit, he was the head of the INTOSAI-Donor Secretariat, working with INTOSAI-Donor Corporation. And before he joined IDI and the IDC, he worked many years for DFID, working with SAIs in different regions and also doing work on fiduciary risk. So Martin, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning to you all. Today I'll talk about the role of SAIs in auditing the domestic budget support of IMF emergency financing. And if we can go to the first slide, please. One more. Okay, great. So emergency financing. First, I want to look at the IMF's emergency financing. As Emmanuel mentioned, at least 85 countries received emergency financing totaling over 160 billion US dollars. And this wasn't done in the IMF's usual way with extensive diagnostics, missions, consultations and plans. Rather, funding was mobilized and dispersed rapidly and upfront to help countries deal with immediate budget and balance of payment pressures arising from huge revenue falls and emergency spending pressures. In most countries, this was provided as direct budget support, channeled through country systems, and therefore relying on the strength of those systems to address governance vulnerabilities and prevent misuse, fraud and corruption. This IMF funding was therefore mingled with domestic funding and other emergency funding to create a fiscal envelope used to fund each government's emergency response package. So to think about the impact of this for SAIs, it's useful to look and refer to the first COVID-19 audit report issued by the Auditor General of South Africa. The report focuses on the financial management of the government's 500 billion rand fiscal response package for COVID-19. It notes that the package was funded by reprioritising the budget and securing loans, including from the IMF, the African Development Bank and the New Development Bank. Funds from these loans fund the portion of the response package that could not be funded by reprioritising the budget. So the audit report looks at the whole package of emergency spending, rather than attempting to focus on specific sources of finance, because actually it's meaningless and impossible to try to distinguish these funds from the rest of the emergency response package. Next slide, please. I'd now like to turn to the role of SAIs during the emergency and why SAIs suddenly became so much more important to the IMF. Now, the IMF has long worked with SAIs. Many IMF programs have a strong focus on macro fiscal risks and therefore include structural benchmarks relating to the audit of specific agencies, audit of subject matter such as arrears, and quite often the audit of state-owned enterprises, especially in extractive industries. But due to COVID-19, the nature of emergency financing changed the safeguards that the IMF applied. So conditionalities to be met before the release of future funding tranches could not be used because 100% of the funding had already been provided up front. So instead, the IMF introduced these commitments in letters of intent agreed as part of the emergency financing. And as the funding was mainly budget support, the default arrangement for the audit of the use of emergency financing has to be audited by the Supreme Audit Institution. No other body has the mandate, the prior experience, and the knowledge to audit the use of public funds. In addition, audits by the SAI feed into the broader national system for accountability and oversight, including oversight by the legislature, executive response, and independent follow-up of the implementation of audit recommendations. Finally, most SAIs have the legal right and often the responsibility to refer suspicions of fraud and corruption to the appropriate investigative and law enforcement agencies. Further to performing these traditional roles, SAIs are in a strong position to understand the emergency context created by COVID-19, such as the use of emergency procurement rules. SAIs also understand the increased risks that the changes bring, as well as risks stemming from the emergency context with its focus on speed over control. Lastly, in many countries, governments responded to the emergency by creating extra budgetary funds, which sit outside the budget and normal government processes, but which are an essential part of the response package. Again, many SAIs have experience of auditing such funds and are aware of the challenges these funds bring, both in terms of accountability arrangements, but also audit mandates. So it is natural that with so much emergency financing dispersed, organisations such as the IMF should turn their attention to the work of Supreme Audit institutions. Next slide, please. So as most of you will know, it's a fundamental principle of SAIs that to be effective and considered credible by their stakeholders, an SAI must have independence from the entities it audits. What this means is set down in the Mexico Declaration, which identifies 8 pillars of SAI independence. The third principle covers SAI operations, including specifically that SAIs should have full discretion in the discharge of their duties, in particular freedom from direction or interference in the selection of audit issues. Now, this raises several theoretical questions about audit commitments in letters of intent, or LOIs, agreed as part of emergency financing. Now, we should recall that the LOIs are statements of country commitments written to the IMF as part of emergency financing. They are frequently signed by the Minister of Finance and or the head of the central bank. Now, as the IMF deals with countries as members of the IMF, it can enter dialogue with and sign commitments related to any country institution. So it can hold dialogue with SAIs and include commitments relating to SAIs. But thinking about the Mexico Declaration, it's also crucial that the SAI should be free from direction in the selection of its audits. It shouldn't be for the Minister of Finance or the head of the central bank to make a commitment regarding what entities are subject to the SAI will audit. On the other hand, if the SAI was engaged in dialogue and agreed to a specific audit commitment because it saw the value in such an audit, then SAI independence would be preserved. So what do the audit commitments in LOIs actually look like in practice? Actually, there's a huge variety. They vary regarding the audit subject matter, the audited entity, the time frame, and the nature of the audit. Some LOIs include very specific requirements, for example, that the IMF COVID-19 emergency financing be subject to a financial audit after the crisis has abated. Other commitments provide a much higher degree of flexibility and simply call for the SAI to conduct and report publicly on an audit of the use of emergency financing. Why such a variety? Well, LOI commitments were drafted very quickly in the middle of an emergency by countries, each in dialogue with different groups of IMF officials. There wasn't actually any time to explore the issue in depth, establish sound principles and disseminate good practice that could be followed by different countries. And in most countries, SAIs were not part of the dialogue. In fact, a recent IDI survey looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the independence of SAIs found that in only 16% of countries receiving the emergency finance did the SAI participate in dialogue on the audit arrangements. I think if you balance this against the speed at which emergency financing was mobilised, I don't think this is necessarily poor, but it does raise a question about whether or not SAI independence was compromised. However, the same survey also asked SAIs whether in practice they were able to freely decide on the selection of topics and contents of audits, including audits of COVID-19 spending. Here the results are clear. 94% of our SAIs that responded said that while they were free to decide on their audits. So my interpretation of these results is that while the SAIs were largely outside the discussions on audit commitments in LOIs, in practice they have been given the necessary freedom to interpret how those commitments are applied in practice. And therefore independence doesn't seem to have been undermined in the vast majority of countries. Last slide, please. Finally, I'd just like to touch on the responsiveness of SAIs. So the requirements for SAI independence tell us that what powers a SAI needs to be effective and credible. But as the Peter Parker principle tells us, with great power comes great responsibility. And so it is with SAIs. The powers in the Mexico Declaration are balanced with responsibilities to make a difference to the lives of citizens. And these are actually set down in the framework for the value and benefits of SAIs, now known as ISAI 12. Here, Principle 5 is key. So to demonstrate relevance to citizens, parliament and stakeholders, SAIs should be responsive to changing environments and emerging risks. Now, COVID-19 represents such a major challenge and change to the SAI environment and brings with it so many emerging risks that it calls into question the continuing validity of the audit programs established pre-COVID. Another IDI survey of SAI responses to COVID-19 found that at least 3/4 of SAIs did actually review and update their annual audit programs in response to COVID-19. So what sort of adjustments did SAIs make? Most SAIs actually planned relevant compliance and financial audits. These are focused on areas where the majority of emergency funds are being spent, meaning the health, social and economic sectors. In addition, forensic audits have been conducted to follow up on initial audit findings and on information from whistleblowers. And in some countries, performance audits are being conducted on topics such as the storage and distribution systems for COVID-19 supplies and equipment. In conclusion then, COVID-19 has had a profound impact on how the IMF engages with SAIs and on how SAIs remain responsive to citizens. I see the IMF and SAIs as having a shared goal of enhanced transparency, accountability and ensuring that SAIs can contribute to good financial governance and fighting corruption. My hope is that closer dialogue and cooperation between the IMF and the INTOSAI community will continue through this emergency and well into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that insightful presentation and for letting us understand a little bit more about what it entails for the SAIs conducting audits on emergency financing and the experiences that you've been able to also draw out of that survey on emergency financing audits that you did a couple of months ago. And so I think that's very helpful also for people to understand, those that haven't yet conducted audit on emergency financing, how that can be done and what is the focus sectors. And that of course can be very much specific to country and governance setup as well. And I think now is a good time to go on to our moderated discussion. So in this part of our event, we'll be talking to, we will keep Martin on, but we'll be joined by a couple of more panelists, Joel Turkovich from the IMF, Gerald Pute from SAI Malawi, and Tamba Mumu from the Audit Office of, or the Audit Service of Sierra Leone. So in this discussion, I'll be asking them questions both regarding the IMF approach and policies, but also about the SAIs' own experience relating to the emergency financing and which kind of dialogue they've had with IMF and how they've been able to use the results and the reaction to the results. So before we go on, I just want to welcome you, the three of you, all of you. I'm very happy to have you with us. I'll go quickly through the introduction of our panelists. So starting with Joel. Joel Turkowitz is a senior counsel in the IMF legal department at its headquarters in Washington, D.C. He specializes in anti-corruption and rule of law issues. He has a 20-year career working with the World Bank on governance and anti-corruption, and he's worked and written on anti-corruption approaches and experiences and has very extensive experience both in Asia and Africa. So welcome to you, Joe. Then we have Gerald Blessings-Pute. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He is the Director of Regularity Audit in the National Audit Office of Malawi, and he's been leading some of the work on audit of emergency funding in the SAI Malawi. So welcome to you, Gerald.
Thank you.
Good to have you with us. And last but not least, Tamba Mumu, who is the Deputy Auditor General in special audits at the Audit Service of Sierra Leone, and also been heavily involved in the work that SAI Sierra Leone have been done on emergency financing. And as you probably all know, Sierra Leone also had extensive experience in relation to the Ebola virus and the management of that crisis as well. So we're very excited to hear from you all. I'll be starting by asking some questions for Joel. So Joel, I'm sure that a lot of people are, even with the presentation of Emmanuel just now and some of the introduction given by Martin, I'm sure that most are still very much excited to understand more about the relationship between IMF and SAIs. So in the past, IMF's involvement with SAIs have been focused on benchmark for audit of specific accounts, domestic accounts, and services such as domestic arrears, also a focus on benchmarks and relating to state-owned enterprises, and even going more detailed into specific sectors such as extractive industries. But what we would like to ask you first is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way in which IMF engages with SAIs?
So thank you, Camilla, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. And as my colleague Emmanuel has mentioned, really great and appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion and continue to engage with the community. So as you mentioned, the IMF has had significant experience with SAIs before, both when we looked and did just a quick search over the last 15 years, we've had over 200 benchmarks and programs that related to SAIs and auditing. And as you mentioned, a large number of them have related to specific audits, like an audit of oil reserves, or an audit of the revenues from oil, or audits of specific state-owned enterprises due to specific concerns. And I also want to stress that in addition to the structural benchmarks, we've also had a significant amount of work on capacity development that has been primarily through our fiscal affairs department, that has looked and worked with audit agencies, often on issues around independence as part of their overall work on strengthening public financial management. So there's also been that engagement. But as you say, and as was mentioned in the first presentation by the IMF, we really have taken a much more systematic approach to SAIs in the COVID emergency based upon a number of different things. One, I think, is the experience with audit agencies in previous emergencies has demonstrated their absolute importance in making sure that money is spent properly and in delivering services to people. So as you mentioned, the previous Sierra Leone audit of Ebola was, I think, profoundly important in directing public money to public services. The audit that was done in Zambia right before COVID of looking at emergency responses indicated sort of the ability for audit agencies to identify clear vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. And in the US, we've also seen clear demonstration of the power of audits to change and impact upon responses. When you look at for example, the difference between the amount of money lost in the response to the Katrina storm versus the amount of money lost in response to Sandy. The Sandy storm a number of years later, a large number of the things that were changed had to do with audits and the recommendations that audit agencies had. So in the response to COVID and building into the response to COVID has been much stronger highlighting of the critical role of supreme audit institutions in ensuring accountability and strengthening accountability, a commitment to working with audit agencies and not thinking about third-party audits or alternative structures for auditing. So staff guidance particularly identified the importance of working with supreme audit institutions as part of this audit commitment. And even in those situations where audit agencies, because of resource constraints, struggle to do these audits, the idea has been very much, how does the IMF support the audit agency accessing additional resources and additional expertise and not identifying alternative or parallel paths? So it's been quite a change in thinking or approach that has put SAIs front and center in the approach to COVID in terms of accountability and oversight. And I think while it's true that this is very much about emergency audits, it also, I think, reflects our increasing understanding of the essential role that audit agencies play, their critical, the critical need to support their independence and their autonomy, as well as in going forward, that vital role that they will play in addressing governance and issues of misuse of public funds. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Joel, for that extensive response. I also like to just ask you a follow-up question to what you mentioned. You mentioned different experiences, for example, like in handling different crises, such as you mentioned Katrina, and Sandy also mentioned the Ebola crisis. So just as an off the top of your head, how do you think about, do you see any differences in the response or in the responsiveness of SAIs in this time compared with previous similar situations?
I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think I'd be very keen to hear the responses of people working within Supreme Audit institutions. I think one of the things about COVID, both its global nature, but also its universal nature within a country, given the public health crisis nature of it, as well as the significant amount of private resources that have often been donated to respond to the COVID crisis. I think one of the things that we've seen is a really heightened expectation by the public that money will be used accountably, as well as that audit agencies will ensure that auditing is done, there's just-in-time auditing as well as just-in-time accountability. So it seems to us that there has been this tremendous uptick in actually the amount of attention being placed on audit reports or audit findings, and a higher sort of degree of expectations, and that we've seen actually a very large number of very impressive audit reports coming out under very difficult circumstances. So I do think audit agencies are tremendously stepping up to the task of responding to the emergency in real time.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. It sounds like also the impression is that SAIs are getting more responsive. And as you know, this is also the overarching theme of our series under responsive SAIs. So we'll be discussing that more also. I now want to kind of move on to my next question for you. And we've been talking about, and you've been talking about, and Martin presented about the LOI commitments. And we want to ask you about how do you reconcile the use of the audit-related commitments in the LOIs as they are, and the need for SAI independence, which have also been touched upon by Martin in his presentation.
Thanks. I think this is a very important issue. I think one, and Martin, I think, has touched upon a number of the things, but let me sort of go back. I think first, what is really important to understand is, so the Ministry of Finance is our chief interlocutor, but the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Finance serves as the representative of the state and brings together the different bodies of the state that relate to the IMF relationship and engagement. So that's why some of our programs have things like adoption of laws, or reform of judicial processes, or a range of things that are clearly not the responsibility or the authority of the Ministry of Finance. It's the Ministry of Finance responsibility to organize the state's response by communicating with those different bodies. So that's one thing to, I think, understand overall. I think we're very clear both and deeply respect the Lima and the Mexico declarations on SAI independence, and think that it's fundamental to ensuring that we do not reach over and in any way affect the sovereignty or the independence of SAIs. So I think that we truly believe that as a core principle, which is why the letters of intent and the IMF, we do not look or define what things should be audited. We don't attempt to define or suggest how the audit agency should go about its job. We don't in any way look into the actual conduct of the audit any more than we would do in a judicial proceeding. While our work sometimes affects judiciaries, we would never look at an individual case or look at what was going on in a specific case. So we greatly respect the independence of the SAI to define what it does. I think that were we not in an emergency situation, or perhaps in the next emergency situation we find, I think we would make sure that we had more extensive interactions with SAIs to the extent that conditions on auditing were going to be in place to ensure that there was not a misunderstanding, and that indeed these were seen as critical risks that were of central importance to the SAI. So I do think that it's important. We fundamentally respect the independence of the SAIs. In the structuring of the LOI commitments, I think are quite careful to make sure not to suggest in any way SAIs have to follow a particular structure or a particular approach or produce a particular report. And that I think this is a learning experience that, I think the next time, unfortunately, I think we're all pretty sure that there will be emergencies in the future. And I assume that in the next time that we would handle this slightly differently.
Thank you so much, Joel. Yes, we did have actually also on Friday a session on coordination, where we talked about how coordination is very important for the success, then specifically related to capacity development. But of course, in any larger context where, for example, there is a PFM reform or a program like the IMF's country programs. So we see also, I mean, just to refer to what you were just saying, often donors, at least in the CD context which we are operating in here, relates more to the Ministry of Finance. So there are probably I mean, they're probably like on a broader basis, not only with the IMF, a potential to involve the SAIs in dialogues. And we'll hear shortly also from our colleagues from SAI Malawi and SAI Sierra Leone and hear about their experience in that process. So a final question for you then, Joel, is about actually the countries where IMF has a presence. And we want to know in what way IMF has been able to engage with the SAIs after the emergency financing was agreed. If you could tell us a bit about that, please. Thank you.
Sure, and thanks. And I'll try and be brief here so that the other panelists also, we can hear from their experience. You know, I think we've been trying to engage in a couple of different ways. One is, and I do want to stress, we definitely see this, our support and our work as being completely complementary to the other more long-term efforts that have been undertaken to support SAIs. So we definitely, both in the way the support has been structured and shaped, it's been very much influenced by trying to complement existing work. So I think our efforts are been along a couple of different levels. One is sort of regular monitoring of progress, just to see where are the audits and how is the Supreme Audit Institution progressing in auditing, so that we understand actually where the nature of the process is, and reporting this to the board, because the board is actively interested in this issue. A second dimension to sort of encourage further progress is when we have further lending or discussions of financial arrangements in countries, if often there have been prior actions or structural benchmarks built into those programs that relate to progress on auditing COVID spending or on increasing transparency around COVID spending. So we've tried to sort of encourage and support the continued process of auditing. The third thing, and we'll talk about this in the next session, we've organized a capacity development program very much in partnership with IDI and others, to try and provide assistance in both identifying issues, both upstream issues that are constraints on auditing, as well as downstream issues, which are constraints on responding to audits and having follow-up, with a particular attention to governance and corruption issues, which I'll also mention a little later. So we've organized that. We've run a number of different sort of learning sessions to begin with, and we've started working with particular countries, individual countries such as Mozambique, to work on trying to address some of the core constraints, particularly around frameworks, around the legal and organizational frameworks for undertaking and following up audits. But I'll stop there because we'll be able to talk more about this in the second session, but that's our overall approach.
Thank you so much, Joel, for that response and for your insights on working with SAI from the IMF viewpoint. As you were saying, we will come back to the CD program later on. Now I'll just go very briefly to my colleague Martin, because we think it's only fair that when we have asked the IMF why they want to engage with SAIs, we also see that IDI is one of the main providers of SAI capacity development within INTOSAI. And for that reason, we want to ask Martin, Martin, what is the reason that SAIs should be engaging with IMF on this topic? And can you also mention perhaps the main reason for IDI going into collaboration with IMF on this topic?
Sure, thank you, Camilla. I think my first point would be just to recognise that in the past, there wasn't such a huge amount of cooperation between the IMF and SAIs. And I think there was quite a bit of, in some countries, a lack of understanding. In some countries, maybe a misunderstanding. And I've heard from some countries where there was kind of a fraught relationship. And when I look at this situation, I see that IMF and SAIs fundamentally want the same thing. And the way that IMF provides its support through the budget means that actually its objectives are very closely aligned with the SAI. They're concerned that the money is well spent, contributes to economic growth and poverty reduction, and they're concerned about the accountability and the transparency of public finances. And actually, to me, that's almost exactly the same mandate and interest that SAIs have, and also an interest in fighting corruption. So for me, I saw that there was a real gap in understanding and a lack of dialogue. And I think if those relationships between the IMF and the SAI had been a little bit stronger and they knew each other better at the beginning of the emergency, then the whole conversation around the dialogue around the LOIs would have been different. And you would have already had greater inclusion of SAIs in that sort of dialogue when it comes to the question, what audit commitments would make sense in an LOI. So that's one of the reasons for trying to bring the IMF and the INTOSAI community a little bit closer, because yes, as Joel mentioned, it's one emergency. Well, the emergency is still ongoing. Emergency funding is still being provided. And I can't tell you the next global crisis, but I can tell you there will be another one and another one after that. So this question of emergency finance is going to come up, again and again. So for us, my biggest objective was just to bring the INTOSAI community and the IMF closer together and get mutual understanding because they have a shared goal. From the perspective of SAIs, I think it's worth remembering that the IMF is an extremely influential stakeholder that is engaged in not only interest in SAIs, but is engaged in an interest in the entire PFM and governance agenda. And it works on a lot of areas that are fundamental for SAIs to function well, but where the SAIs do not have a great deal of influence. So, I mean, the legal framework around PFM, the legal framework around SAIs, the IMF is one stakeholder that can potentially be influential. And there's several other sort of areas. The IMF is particularly engaged in policy dialogue around PFM reform. And quite often the topics that are being discussed are topics that are extremely interesting and important for SAIs. Whether there's a functioning oversight committee, whether the SAI has got the right to refer findings of suspicions of corruption, for example, to investigative agencies, which in some countries SAIs don't have. These are all areas where the IMF policy dialogue and the SAI's interests are aligned. And quite often the two parties don't talk to each other. And then we should also remember that, yes, this was emergency financing, but the IMF is giving regular financing on an ongoing basis and establishing conditions in that financing and then undertaking monitoring missions. So, it's entirely possible in future that if there are impediments that stop SAIs being able to deliver their work, they can be put up and discussed as potential future conditions or things that IMF, Article 4 monitoring arrangements might actually look into. So the IMF has the potential to be a huge ally for SAIs. Of course, the IMF can't take on every single issue that a country faces, but where an issue is fundamentally critical to the use of public funds, the IMF is a potential very strong ally. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comprehensive response, Martin. I think it's important, as you pointed out, to view this a bit broader and specifically, the issue of bringing in more stakeholders, and especially for us who's been working with SAIs, especially, we have a tendency perhaps to focus very much on the SAI and possibly the Ministry of Finance, but we also see that there is a need to look a bit broader also in the support of SAI. And from what I'm hearing from you, Martin, and also what I've learned from working with this, this is also where we have IMF and where they can actually play a role in terms of also getting a better understanding of where the support can go also for us who are internally in the SAI support part of it, but also for the SAIs to interact and engage with IMF to see how they can be a part of the policy dialogue and in the PMF system. So thank you so much for that. Now I think we're very excited to hear from our SAI representatives. We have some questions for you as well. And I think what we'll do, because is that I will ask the questions, the same questions to both of you, if that's fine. And then I will tell you who to go first. And because I think you might have some different perspective and experiences here, and that's really what we'd like to learn more about today. So Gerald and Tamba, thank you so much. My first question to you is, what was the extent of knowledge in your SAI about IMF emergency funding during the establishment of this agreement of emergency funding from the IMF? I can start with Tamba, perhaps.
Thank you very much, Camilla, and good morning to everyone from Freetown in Sierra Leone. Thank you for organizing this program, IMF, IDI, and also for inviting SAI Sierra Leone to participate. So yes, to your question, Camilla, yes, we were engaged, very well so. When the discussions between the Ministry of Finance and IMF was ongoing, we had a number of meetings where we were invited to. Mostly those meetings were only with IMF. So we do not have that much interaction with our own Ministry of Finance here when IMF was meeting with them. So we were involved and we discussed the role we could play as a SAI. So we were quite happy up to that point. However, when the final agreement was made, we have never seen it. We don't really know whether what we had discussed is in fact what was concluded or included in the report. So basically, to answer, we were involved in the discussions, but as we speak, we have not seen the final agreement. So that would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's interesting to know that you were involved in the process, but you didn't really see the result. Okay, I see. But can I ask you, your involvement in the process, was that due to previous experience, for example, from Ebola, that you already had this experience in dealing with this type of funding?
Well, we were asked, initially we were asked what role we could play. And we said, as the Supreme Audit Institution, and we have the legal backing to do this kind of audits. So we didn't see any challenge with doing the audit. And also in terms of capacity to do work, we have, like you rightly said, and few presenters have mentioned, we have done some work on Ebola anyway. So we were ready to go in our own way. Our involvement was more along the lines of what kind of audits, what kind of timeframes, and whether or not we needed any support. And we said, no, we don't perceive the need for that. But in terms of what was actually concluded, in terms of what will be the role of the SAI, as per all the discussions, we have not really seen that final document to say, this is indeed what the government of Sierra Leone signed for SAI Sierra Leone to do or be involved in. So yes, I think our experience from Ebola contributed to assuring the bank as well as our own government that yes, we could do such an audit without necessarily having any particular support from any outside institutions. So yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. And just, well, I'm sure that our colleagues from IMF is taking well note of your feedback here. But in the meantime, I just think that one question that perhaps many people are asking themselves, when you said, you didn't have any problem in doing this kind of audit, and you didn't also need any capacity or support in doing so. So does that imply that, for example, the legal framework of your SAI is very clear on the role of the SAI in emergency funding audits?
Yes, in our opinion, yes, we are not lawyers. We don't have lawyers in this office, but in our opinion, the Constitution says, Section 119 of the 1991 Constitution, which is the current Constitution, that the Auditor General will audit. It did not specify what kind of audits the Auditor General will do. However, when the Audit Service Act was reviewed, the 1998 Audit Service Act, when it was reviewed in 2014, we made some examples of the kind of audits that we can do. And one of them is, we call it real-time audits or special audits. I must say that when the audit was finally made public, the report was made public, the government, apart from the other reactions that they showed, one of the reactions that from the government was that they did not think that we can carry on doing special audits without the permission of the president. And we said, no, the constitution is very clear that the Auditor General will not be subject to the direction and control of any person or authority. So we don't see any need to speak to anyone about what kind of audit we want to do, where we want to do it, and when we want to do it. So in terms of legal framework, yes, we are very sure. And I think our colleagues from IMF who also looked at the provisions that are available did confirm that there was no need to do any amendments to law, but that the law as we currently have it was sufficient to support such an audit to be undertaken. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamba. That was really interesting to hear, and you also responded partly to one of my other questions. So I think now let's hear from Gerald and the experience of SAI Malawi in terms of the involvement of the SAI during the establishment of the agreement.
Thank you very much, Camilla, and the panelists and all who are in this meeting. Greetings. This is Gerard, as Gerard Pute. The pronunciation is Pute to you, Camilla. And I am Director of Regularity Audit, as already explained. Indeed, in terms of the involvement in the discussions and final agreements between the IMF and the government, the SAI was involved on the onset in terms of the requirement that the funds should be audited. The involvement was premised on the fact that once the funds are in the government coffers, those are public funds, and the Constitution and the Public Audit Act indeed requires that the Auditor General should audit such funds that have been funded either in part or wholly by the government. So all those funds, they are within the definition of public funds. So indeed, the Supreme Audit Institution was involved, and the involvement was the requirement for audit. So, but as to the nitty-gritties of how this audit is going to be done, for example, the issue that we're going to have a quarterly audit on these funds, this one was not properly agreed with the Supreme Audit Institution, but it was part of the letter of intent from the Ministry of Finance and the Reserve Bank with the IMF. So from the earlier discussion here, we can see that, yes, indeed, the IMF is supposed to involve us as a Supreme Audit Institution. But on the onset, it should be a local involvement between the Ministry of Finance and the Supreme Audit Institution, because we are the ones that are looking into the local governance of all the funding that is there. And when we interact with the IMF, to us, we take it as a plus or an additional leverage, because now we are talking to the one who is, like we can say, the horse's mouth, to say that indeed this is their understanding of the issues in the letter of intent and the like. But the main involvement should be between us and the Ministry of Finance, so that the letter of intent should at least contain issues that we have indeed envisaged as to even how we're going to implement them. For example, I can give you an example of the quarterly audits. What it means is there was supposed to be sourcing of funding for those types of audits for each and every quarter. But the type of planning that we already had on the ground was the audit, the annual audits for the government. So that can be evidenced by what happened when we were to start the audit. We found that we were still looking for additional resources for the audits to be undertaken. So in summary, we can say that yes, the Supreme Audit Institution was somehow involved on the onset, but on the nitty-gritties as to how these audits are going to be done, like the frequency and indeed the requirement of the final audit, that was not what was agreed. But when the Supreme Audit Institution got hold of the final letter of intent, we had to take it as part of our mandate and do the audit according to the mandate. Unfortunately, whilst we were planning to do the quarterly audit, we were overtaken by events that the issues were not being properly handled, like there was some kind of mismanagement. So we had to change the focus to say that, oh yes, we are supposed to do the audit as the mandatorily put in the letter of intent, that is as one of the commitments by the government. But as for us, we need to investigate to find out the truth about everything that was awash in the media, mainly the social media by that time. So we went ahead with the investigative audit on the matter. But still on that, we're supposed to have the terms of reference, proper terms of reference, for us not to miss out each and every thing in terms of the expectation of the stakeholders. So instead of doing the quarterly audits, we went ahead to do the investigation, which covered the quarters that preceded the preceded the investigation. So that's what I can respond as of now, Camilla. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gerard. And I think that you already touched upon, I mean, some of my next question was going to be, you know, when you mentioned this issue of quarterly audits, that is surely a kind of a consequence that is very resource demanding on you. And as a consequence of not having consulted you properly, you were then perhaps not able to meet that requirement. And but as you mentioned, the investigation also, my understanding from what you're telling me is that you had to be very agile in the way that you scoped your audit, and that you were looking already into you already had some plans, then you had to adjust your plans a little bit. And can you tell me a little bit more about that process and how you went about like defining what to look at in the audit?
Thank you very much. In this case, when we realized that for us to remain relevant, we are supposed to deliver at least something which is closer or which is exactly on the expectations of the stakeholders, in this case, the citizenry, because there was already an outcry on the ground. So how we did it was to discuss with the government, in this case, the Ministry of Finance, to say that this is what we're expected to do. But with these demands, though the demands were not directly coming to the National Audit Office, the Supreme Audit Institution, but on our watching, we were finding that there was that outcry. So we had to discuss with them in the Ministry of Finance to say that we are going to change the type of audit and even the scoping as well. And we even indicated to them the implications in terms of financial, which they discussed, which they agreed upon discussion with us on a round table, so that indeed, as it was very important. And the Minister of Finance was very eager to release additional funding for us to carry out the audit as it was required. So it was upon involvement with our other stakeholders, mainly the Minister of Finance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And can you then finally say something about the reactions when, I'm assuming that you made a report that, I'm not sure whether you have published it yet, but if you have published any of the results of the audit that you've done, if it's not still ongoing, can you tell us something about the reactions of the audit report or the results of this audit? you also, I mean, you already mentioned the interaction that you had with some of the stakeholders, but perhaps there were other reactions. Tambov told us about the reaction to the audit itself, and the questions about almost the legality of the audit undertaken in terms of mandate. But the results itself also, if there was any specific reaction to what you found.
Thank you very much. In terms of the reaction to what we found, it was a mixed bag. In the first place is that when we finalized the audit, we first of all engaged with the main stakeholder. Yeah, for them to understand what we have found, and if there are issues, to be referred to other law enforcement agencies, and that should be done procedurally. So when that was done, obviously from the Minister of Finance, I think they had also a request received from the High Office of the Land, the Office of the President and Cabinet, to say that we understand that you have received a report to you as the main stakeholder in this regard, but with the tone at the top, the political will at the top, to ensure that there is proper transparency and accountability. And at the same time, because the issue of COVID funds, the mismanagement, like it drew a lot of emotions, because it would be very, very difficult for people just to, the citizens just to sit idle without talking about it, when they're saying that people are dying in multitudes each and every day, and they also hear about the mismanagement of funds. So it was like any issue relating to mismanagement was being received with very, very great emotions, to such an extent that when the report, the results of the report reached the president said that all the law enforcement agencies should work with the National Audit Office and deal with the matters accordingly. And thereafter, there was a spate of law enforcement activities involving arrests of those that were specifically mentioned in the report as to be the ones who perpetrated the mismanagement of the COVID response funding. And from the other quarters, more or less like from the professional bodies, they were like, they did not believe that with a very short period of time that we had done the audit, would produce such results. And the report, which to most of them, they thought was clear and easy to understand in terms of what had transpired. At the same time, there were still some other negative reactions that we also received. But these reactions were coming from the auditees, or those that were affected with the report, to such an extent that some were trying to make allegations that, you know, these auditors did not like involve me fully, to an extent that I would have provided this this evidence, not like the way they did. So to us, we took that as also a very good observation, and sat down with our teams, and we said that I think we found out that those were, I think, issues that come for people who want to like defend themselves when they see that things are now not in the right direction. Because to be honest, even before the onset of the audit, all the affected ministries, departments, and agencies, because they were clustered into sectors, so they were informed in writing, and indeed indicating to them what we're looking for, and even the type of documentation that the National Audit Office would be looking for. And they got the communication, but due to human nature, when something has happened, one would try to find out how one can protect oneself. So with those arrests, now what happened was there was some kind of now unprecedented additional work on the Supreme Audit Institution to such an extent that now the auditors were supposed to provide professional witness in the court of law. And that is the process that is ongoing. As I'm talking now, almost every week, our auditors are going to the courts to present evidence according to the charges that were leveled against the alleged perpetrators. So that's what I can say about the reaction. And that in addition to that, it showed that there is some kind of change in the way we do business in terms of accountability, because of the tone at the top. When I say top at top, I mean now in the presidency, the political will in terms of accountability. And that has changed the whole landscape to such an extent that even if it is the normal financial audit or any type of audit, no public official will take it lightly. So this time around, is when auditors are there, it's like everybody would like to provide as much information as possible, and also not to hide anything, so that they should ensure that things are done properly in terms of the audit process. But in terms of accountability, it's like now the culture of accountability has been given an extra gear. It has been accelerated just because of that single audit. It has also changed the landscape of even the way other stakeholders, mainly the citizenry, perceive the importance of audit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that really comprehensive detailing of how you, the reactions that you've got from the different stakeholders, the process that you've been involved in. It's very, very helpful for everyone, I think, to better understand what the SAI is going through in such a process. The interferences in your work that your experiences, the backlash in a way, and also this importance of the political will or the tone at the top to change practices, but also to understand the importance of accountability, I think. And now we'll very shortly go on to our next session, which is a bit about capacity development in auditing of emergency financing. But before we close this, I want to just ask the both of you, Gerald and Tamba, very briefly, in your view, like given the experiences that you have, in what way can an international partner, be it IMF or another country partner that you might have, be helping you and in continuing to support your work in this kind of context? What would be the best way that they could support you based on your experience? So I'll start with Tamba and then with Gerald.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Camilla, with your permission, I think Gerald seemed to have mentioned a few things that I also would just like to add some quick comments on. In terms of the areas that we looked at in our own audits, just like I mentioned, because we didn't have the final document, i.e. the final agreement, we carried on looking at the resources that were used by the agency of government that was responsible and still is responsible for leading the government's fight against COVID. So it was more like focusing on that agency and the money that they received to carry on the fight. In terms of response, we had a very good response from the general public, civil society, the media. Then we noticed that there was a twist in the public or in the response where the media, some aspect of the media started writing terrible things about the office that were baseless, just to malign the work of the audit service. In terms of response from government, I've already said that governments more or less prevented the next phase of this audit because I don't know the way they reacted to, the general public reacted to the first one. But they also, what they did, they brought in a professional audit firm to look after the resources of the agency that was in charge of the response. So the auditors or accounting firm, BDO, were appointed to help keep an eye on the resources of government. Now, what is interesting to hear from our colleagues in Malawi is how action was taken. In our case, as we speak, we know that the Public Accounts Committee of Parliament sat down and called people to look at these reports. But since that meetings, they had them in February. To date, they don't have a report. They have not published a report. What actions they were going to take, we don't know, other than when we were sitting in those meetings and they were having discussions. So I'm pleased to hear that some practical actions have been taken in Malawi. In terms of support, I think really, if in an environment like in ours where the legislative infrastructure is there, I think is basically implementation of our reports. I have seen many times where IMF, not just in this country, but in other countries, have made it a condition that implementation of audit recommendations is also a factor to be considered in saying what kind of support or how much money government. It's sad to say that, but implementation is a big issue, and I'm sure it's not unique to us. In those areas where they don't have capacity, the SAIs to actually do the work themselves, because in as much as in this kind of special audit, but you're doing it in a condensed environment, condensed time frame. So yes, there's some capacity building requirement that some SAIs may need to help, and also maybe perhaps it doesn't have to come from the IMF necessarily. Some SAIs that are already at advanced stages of doing this kind of work can support other SAIs to help them. I was in one or two instances involved with SAI Nigeria, inside Botswana, when they were at the early stages of planning for these audits. So yes, I think support in capacity building, support in making sure that the framework is there and that SAIs are independent and allowed to do their work without interference. I think that's those who help greatly. Thank you very much for those questions, and thank you for allowing us to participate.
Thank you so much, Tamba, and also for adding those additional things. In the interest of time, I won't comment anymore, but I'll just pass the word quickly on to Gerald for a very brief encounter before we move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camilla, and thank you very much, Tamba, for the sentiments. Just to quickly go straight to the question, is that what we expect the IMF to do is to increase the engagement with the Supreme Auditing Institution. And that engagement, it will require issues like support on technical issues, because yes, because as much as the accountability aspect of it is very important to the nation, for example, like Malawi, and the work of the Supreme Auditing Institution, the values and the benefits of the citizen of Malawi, but at the same time, the IMF does not provide that support in vain. It has an objective, and definitely the objective that is achieved in terms of what that support has done, it is both to the benefit of Malawi or the country in general, and indeed even to IMF. Therefore, these interactions and even the support in terms of any support that can come to the side, technically or in other aspects, is very, very important. And even from experience with the IDI in the past, we have had this connection with the financiers and the donors to engage with us, the Supreme Auditing Institutions, to be sure that what we are doing is done in the right direction. So this call is not very different from what Tamba said, but it has got that aspect which is coming up with even the experience that we have had before, and that is very, very important. As for the way forward in SAI-Malawi, we have already started another phase of the audit. And the government has been very, very responsive on that one, to such an extent that once we saw that we are towards starting our annual audits, and that would not have time to do it using our own officers, we agreed and we discussed and agreed with the government that we should outsource, so that we should also leverage on the timeliness of the audit. And that is what is happening. The private audit has been engaged. We do everything under our supervision. And we have some officers who participated in the previous audits to partner with these outsourced auditors to make sure that they do not miss anything, like missing the touch of the Supreme Audit Institution as the Supreme Auditor of the land in this case. So that's what I can add as of now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. And I think especially thanks to our SAI representatives from SAI-Malawi and SAI-Sierra Leone. I think that's been very informative and also expanding our understanding of actually what it takes to conduct an audit on emergency financing in the fields, and actually what are the practical challenges, opportunities that arise from doing such an exercise. I think we heard both positives and negatives in that regard, and especially to hear that accountability and auditing is actually, or audit and accountability is actually like on the agenda of the political leadership, and also that this is actually something that's taken seriously by citizens, CSOs, and other stakeholders. Very important, because as you were both saying rightfully, this is money that's going to the benefit of the citizens, and if it doesn't get back to the citizens, then of course one can in some ways submit an audit report and recommendations, but the impact of the work that the SAI is doing is reduced, and of course challenges are increasing for those who are not receiving the support financially, or by whether it's during a COVID crisis, face masks, vaccines, or whatever they should be receiving. So thank you so much again, and Gerald and Tamba, and thank you also Joel and Martin for your insights. With this, I conclude this session 1 of our event, and we'll move on to session 2. Thank you so much. So session 2, we'll be talking about support for SAIs in auditing emergency financing and developing capacity. And I think at this point, we've gotten a lot of useful input to bring with us into this part of the session. Now, just from a practical point of view, we're running a bit behind on our schedule. So for those, we'll have first, again, some presentations. And then we'll have, again, a moderated discussion. So if I can ask those who have presentations to see if they can shorten it by a couple of minutes, that would be greatly appreciated. I know that, Mike, you have 5 minutes, and I see you joined us here, so perhaps it's a bit difficult for you. But for the others, if there is a possibility, that is great. And we'll be starting off with Jostein Telnes, who is a senior manager in the bilateral unit in IDI. And many of you probably know already Jostein, so I won't use some time to introduce him. He's been in most of our workshops along with myself the last week. So I'll just hand over to you, Jostein.
Thanks a lot, Camilla. Can you hear me well? I think you were nodding, so it means you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Yeah, so the rational approach and challenges to auditing emergency financing. I think much has been said already about this, especially about the rationale and part of the approach, and also, of course, some challenges. I will then concentrate a bit on what can I say, the challenges that we have seen in some specific cases to illustrate a bit further on how this can play out, and especially in some also challenging contexts. So let's move on to the next slide. Yeah, I would like to start here a bit general. We issued this advice or guidance on how SAIs can learn from previous crises and audit let's say funding to emergencies and efforts related to COVID-19. We issued this in April 2020 to really be preparing SAIs to step up for this task, and also some advice to development partners on safeguards that could be relevant. So I would just highlight, I think in terms of the overall approach of SAIs, I think most of those advices there are still relevant in the ongoing situation, and also for emergency funds in particular. And very briefly, I think the overall one is that the SAIs, yes, of course, there's this task of doing relevant audits, right? Timely audits, that's definitely there. And it, of course, there's many different types and so on. But what we also point out is that there's a big importance of SAIs, an approach of SAIs here to also, let's say, be a critical friend and remind key actors about basic rules and regulations that must be adhered to also even during an emergency. So that means trying to take up an active public role and communicate with also government and other implementing agencies, let's say through public statements and so on. So there are some examples of that being happening. So that's much SAIs can do there. Then, of course, we have talked a lot, sorry, not that slide yet. Then we have talked a lot about, of course, the, let's say, dialogue between IMF and SAIs and so on. So obviously that's important, but that's also, of course, the SAIs needs to definitely keep a dialogue with other stakeholders as well, in and outside of government, on the potential role of the SAI to understand the evolving crisis and the evolving risks, to really select those audits that can add most value. And then also, there are obviously special risks that I think Martin explained and others here that have been unfolding in such a crisis situation, and that's, those are there. But then if the SAI can contribute to it, it means, or to reduce those risks, I mean, obviously it has to also issue timely audits and do them, not wait to really add value. So that's what kind of the fundamental argument here of the SAI embarking on audits in real time, not wait, try to do quick reports, special reports, issue them soon. I think that's an important approach. But let's go on to some specific cases and discuss a bit on the challenges that we have seen. Next slide, please. So this is now from South Sudan. The country received emergency funding in November or so from the IMF, which came at a very, let's say, needed time for this country. It was the first, I think, loan by the IMF to South Sudan. There are many challenges in that country and in PFM in particular. However, the crisis was really massive, not only because of COVID-19, but also other issues. So, rising food prices, etc., big risk for let's say, increased violence and problems in the country. So the funding came at a good time, but and then the SAI, of course, was asked to, in the letter of intent, requested to also, or required to do an audit of the funds. Now, what are some of the let's say, challenges arising? So I think what we saw is that, first of all, it took some time to get the audit started. And that's, here we can, the picture here is from a planning meeting where we kind of, we knew this was coming up and we agreed with the SAI, we would, the SAI had formed some audit teams and so on. But and we could work together to plan the audit in a way, because of course, based on the letter of intent, we knew overall what this was about. But it took quite some time to really make the audit take off. The SAI waited for the financial statements of the Ministry of Finance on the use of these funds, and also it also required to have funding specifically for this audit. So in many challenged countries, of course, there's very limited government funding for the SAI and its operations. So, and in particular in South Sudan, and the Auditor General basically said that we cannot do this audit if you don't have extra funding for it. So that basically challenge is to get them started, although it's provided there. So the question is, what is the general point here? I think the general point is that there has to be, if there isn't a good overall forum for development partners and the SAI where these issues can be raised and that it's clarified, that helps. I mean, in South Sudan, you had this so-called oversight committee of the PFM reform, where this challenge was on the table, where IMF participated and others, and that helped to, I think, move things forward. Now, another challenge is then, what are really then the conditions for the use of the funds, and what should be the audit scope? So in South Sudan, of course, there was a letter of intent, quite general, assisting the country to, let's say, deal with the massive macroeconomic crisis. So it was not specific on what those funds should be used for. However, the government decided that, well, let's use these for clearing the salary arrears. So government employees had not been paid salaries for at least 5 months in 2020. So it would, said that this emergency funding should be used for that. So the audit was planned with that in mind, that, okay, it's about audit of salaries. Now, what appeared is that of those 52 million USD that was transferred to South Sudan in this first funding, the share that actually of those dollars that were provided for salaries appeared to be much less than that full amount, more like 1/3. And it may seem a bit wrong, but not necessarily, because obviously the letter of intent was opening for the spending of a lot of not only salaries. The government had decided. But of course, the audit was planned with this in mind, the government decision. But it appeared that the government had decided to, let's say, use a particular exchange rate, quite favorable exchange rate, making that it's kind of you could argue that a lot of the funds had been actually used for salaries, while then also freeing up dollars for other purposes, which of course also the government has liabilities in many other areas, which obviously could also make sense. But fundamentally, I would say that it was a challenge. I mean, to establish the clear, audit criteria, the clear audit scope here, whether it should be covering, let's say, what the government had decided, or if it was the IMF, let's say, or complete amount in dollars. So I think a general point and lesson learned is that I think it goes back to that dialogue also between the SAI and the IMF, but also maybe the SAI and other partners on really understanding the conditions for the funds and the funding and the subject matter, so to speak, and then to set the right audit criteria and the scope. Then a final challenge here is the audit of, let's say, the emergency funds versus the overall annual audit. I think Martin mentioned the audit in South Africa, where they basically, audited all the emergency actions, not particularly from one donor, and reported on that as part of, because the funds came as a part of the overall budget. Now, in South Sudan, the audit they were tasked, embarking on was, audit of this particular, let's say, funds, and in particular the salary arrears for 2 months. And in a country as South Sudan, where there's very limited resources in the SAI, and the SAI has not for many years not issued the annual audit report. I mean, of course, they can't issue on the financial statements because they are not there, but they could issue a compliance audit report, but it's not done. Now, the question is, should you request the SAI to only do an audit assignment of only 2 months of the year. Why should it not be involved, include also the complete payment of salary for that year, both donor and, let's say, government funds, when you first do that audit? So I think that was you know, in light of this overall idea of do no harm and, you know, ensure coordination, harmonization, I think that's an important, really an important issue, that whether that can be improved upon in next emergencies, to make sure that the audit is considered done together with the annual audit, and that emergency funding and loan agreements, that it stimulates to enabling those, let's say, key core audits, government obliged audits to be done. Yeah, so next slide, please. Yeah, here is the report. So at least it's out. It's on the web page of the Ministry of Finance. It's been shared with the President and Prime Minister, which is good. And obviously this has to be used for learning for next version. Please, next slide. Then I would just share a bit from Madagascar. It's also a challenging context, but they have embarked on, let's say, audits of not, let's say, only the funds for salaries, but also for really like socioeconomic progress in terms of a program to distribute food, and one to let's say share funds to persons out of jobs. And very briefly, I mean, these audits, you know, we would embark on them ideally by identifying, you know, comparing the number of target groups that are in the country for these funds, right? So the target group in terms of who are really in need of food, and who are really, you know, out of jobs and would be available for this, but or should, you know, receive these funds, and compare, you know, this. But fundamentally, that type of statistics or registries are not available. So the audit then relies on, you know, assessing the system for how government has been, let's say, selecting people for these programs and those processes. But again, that is quite challenging, because then you really need to sample that selection process and how it goes. And at the current stage, that's has become very, very challenging. So I know that is also a bit related to this situation where there's lack of electronic data, and also difficult to do field work during COVID-19. So yeah, that's just a challenge that is really challenges there in getting, you know, a fairly good audit done. Yeah. So hopefully that what can come out of it is a stronger effort for having, you know, good government registers on the population, so that one is able to actually have better controls and, let's say, reach target groups in such crisis, and that can be learned from it. I suppose also that the increased use of digital tools and data, and also in Madagascar, of course, it's also a lot about the overall, let's say, legislation and management of the emergency situation. Yeah, so to sum up, these were some challenges. I hope they can help us think more clearly about these things, how it plays out, the possibilities of SAIs. I think these SAIs have tried a lot, and will report on things. So that's at least the positive one. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jostein. I think we have to move on to the next presenter at this point, because we only have 15 minutes left of our session. But thank you so much for providing more insight about the capacity challenges and other challenges of the SAIs. So I'll just leave the floor directly then to our next speaker, which I believe to be, I just have to, I think this will be, I'm sorry, Shafiq. Shafiq, you're next.
Yes, Camilla. Can we have the slides, please, Camilla?
Yes, we have slides here. Can the event organizer please bring up the slides of Shafiq? That's the SAI audit, please.
Yes,
thank you. And the main
you.
thing I can say that Shafiq is a senior manager in IDI in the professional and relevant SAIs work stream, and he's been working a lot in developing this program that he will be talking about. Over to you, Shafiq.
Thank you, Camilla. I will be trying to be brief and of course linked to what already Jostein mentioned, and also our colleagues from Sierra Leone and Malawi, they have mentioned as well that they are doing this like emergency funding audit. And this TAI audit, which is transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness of the emergency expenditure of the emergency funding for COVID-19 that we initiated last year in 2020, I think in the July-August period. Can you please go back to the first slide still? Go back, please. Yes. So we started the discussion at that time, and then we invited the SAIs around October 2020 to participate. And we also discussed with all the INTOSAI regions. So we then launched it globally with all regions to participate in this TAI audit. Basically, it focused on the three aspects: transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness of the expenditure of the countries that are spending on COVID-19. Yes, now we can go to the next slide, please. So in short, we are calling it TAI audits, and some features of these audits basically to tell you that its methodology is based on the ISTHAI 4000, this compliance audit. So we are talking about three basic subject matters here, covering emergency procurement or donations or supply. So if the countries are spending on emergency procurement, like many countries are doing it on health sector, so some SAIs are doing that audit on procurement. Some SAIs are also doing audit on socioeconomic packages, because many countries are also distributing large amount of money, and how the distribution is happening. And also we are assisting some SAIs in conducting the national rollout of vaccines. So vaccines, we are not assisting them in procurement, but on the rollout part of the vaccines. And the other features that we have here, we are calling it the agile audit. I think we had some discussion at the beginning about the agility of the audit. Because of the issue that we are facing, the entities are also struggling in performing their key task. And then if the audit comes, so that the auditors also need to be showing some empathy to the entities. And then I think Jostein also mentioned, and other colleagues also mentioned, that how can they deliver quickly and then also deliver continuously, and not like going for a long traditional audit that will take, let's say, a year or less, and then it will not be actually relevant to the context in their operating. And also always be more flexible to change with the audit, so that we do not fixated with the plan and then try to change with the findings that we are seeing in the field. And of course, also most essential topics should be addressed first, and then we can add value with that. So these are the key features, some features of the TAI audit that we are talking about. And also, of course, we are focusing on the quality and asking the SAI teams to consider the impact that this audit will have. Basically, towards the end, what change they will foresee through this audit that will happen in their country context. And in doing the audit, we are also assisting them in the stakeholder engagement from the planning, conducting, and reporting. So these are some basic methodology that we are following in the TAI audit. Yes, we can go to the next slide, please. So what is the outcome that we are foreseeing through this audit? So we are saying that the setting up of more transparent, accountable, and inclusive framework for public spending during emergencies. So countries, we find that in our experience in the regions, that some regions still are very weak in this framework of public spending, and especially for emergencies. So maybe this audit will contribute to that. And then what are the aspects of transparency, accountability, inclusiveness, and to what extent they are covered now, and to what extent the SAI teams will be able to recommend to improve that framework, where to include this transparency, accountability, inclusiveness, which might be missing now. And most importantly, one aspect that we are covering here is the inclusiveness, anything which was missing before. And this inclusiveness we are also trying to address from planning, conducting, and reporting. And we also have developed audit questions where we included these inclusiveness aspects. And we are asking or assisting the SAI teams also to include these inclusiveness aspects in their recommendations, so that it will not be missed towards the audit report, in the audit report as well. So yeah, next slide, please. I'm sorry if there is a sound from outside. So in total, we have 46 SAIs participating from all INTOSAI regions. And we also have partners like INTOSAI Compliance Audit Subcommittee, who are giving us guidance on the compliance aspects, compliance audit aspects. INTOSAI regions, all the regions are partners. We have partners like International Budget Partnership, colleagues from World Bank. I think Arun is also here today. Of course, Joel is here. Joel was also engaging with us from the beginning. We have colleagues from Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, who helped us in formulating the questions on vaccine rollout. Very, very helpful. We are also collaborating with IADB and SSCA Global. IBP also helping us in the stakeholder engagement at the local level as well, the SAIs. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is just a snapshot of the 46 SAIs that we have in different regions. All the SAIs are actually now conducting the audit, but they are at different levels because the participation is flexible. So some SAIs have joined together, but some SAIs have also joined late. So some are at conducting phase, some are at the planning phase, some are still in the middle. So we are going on at different paces with different regional SAIs. Next slide, please. Yes, this is about how are we actually supporting the SAIs. So we have done a needs assessment at the very beginning last year, I mean in July, August period. And then we had discussed with the leaderships of the SAIs what topics would they audit. For example, from there, we actually identified these 3 topics of socioeconomic package, then vaccine rollout, and also the procurement. And we have developed a model audit guide. That's what we call the TAI audit guide. So which is actually helping all the SAIs to do it in a consistent manner. And also we developed the audit questions bank. And these question banks are also developed for the 3 topics, and experts from the different subject matter also helped us to develop these audit questions. And then we assisted the SAI teams or build their capacity to conduct this in the online platform. And we are also supporting them in conducting the audit, in planning and conducting the audit through that online platform that IDI has on its LMS. So basically the audit is going on now, and we are helping them, and we expect them, some of the SAIs will complete the audit by the end of this year and publish their reports. But we also expect that most of them will be completing by first quarter of next year or even before that, because some regions have started late, and because we have to translate them into other languages like French, Arabic, and Spanish. So those regions have started after the English regions. So yes, that's more or less the update about the TAI audit and the plan that we have. And thank you, Camilla. And that's from my side.
Thank you so much, Shafiq, for providing all that information in such a brief time. Yes, again, we are a bit sorry that we have to cut you short, because we know that everyone here thinks the TAI initiative is very interesting, and you seem to have a lot of traction for it already with the 46 SAIs there. And I'm sure the interest will only increase as more and more countries are really feeling the repercussions after the COVID pandemics, which will probably follow us for a long time. And now I'll hand over to Joel Turkowitz again, who will be talking about the IMF CD program, which is something we've been looking forward to. And please go ahead, Joel. I'm sure the SAIs who are participating here today is very interested in learning more about this.
Great. So thanks, Camilla, and thanks so much for all of the other presentations and inputs. I mean, I found all of them to be fascinating, and the discussions from Malawi and Sierra Leone incredibly rich. I know we have almost very, very little time, so I just want to say a couple things about the capacity building program. It is designed to be very flexible. It's designed to complement the work that's going on in the long term for building support. And it's designed around the production of emergency audits for COVID spending, but it is a part of a more long-term approach. It's open, so a couple of just specifics. It is focused, it's open to any country that is interested. It doesn't require that you've received an IMF loan or financing. It's at request. It includes both dimensions of in-country support as well as regional activities and learning from each other, because it's clear that the level of knowledge and learning within SAIs is tremendous. And it is very much focused on, these 3 dimensions of doing the audit, publishing the audit, and following up on the audit. since these are fundamental functions, as well as challenges in many situations. We do have a particular focus and emphasis on identifying and addressing issues relating to governance and corruption. And the note that Martin indicated in the chat function, where he signaled this joint note, sets out a little bit of the trends that exist around addressing corruption and the role of SAIs in addressing corruption. So I'm not going to go into those now, but just emphasize that the structured work of the capacity building program emphasizes both work on identifying and addressing constraints on conducting audits, as well as addressing constraints and barriers to publishing findings and observations, as well as follow-up. We have a particular focus on frameworks, so identifying things that relate to legal frameworks or organizational frameworks, but we do have the flexibility to respond to specific requests that aren't solely related to the frameworks. So we are quite open, and thanks to the generosity of the government of Germany, we have built into the program this high degree of flexibility to respond to the needs that SAIs identify as things that they really want to work on in a short period of time. And I do emphasize that this is a 2 to 3 year program of support designed specifically around the emergency audits, but as I say, in very strong connection with the complementarity of others, including very much the work that IDI and INTOSAI do to ensure that their members are supported and provide assistance. The dimensions of this often include an initial work on identifying those constraints, and a second set of work on looking at organizational responses to addressing them. I know we're actually out of time, so and I don't want to keep people longer. I would ask if anyone else from the IMF would like to come in for momentarily to highlight 1 or 2 things, please do so, but I don't want to keep people. Just to say also, though, we are tremendously, we're available and very flexible to respond to any questions. So after this meeting, if anyone wants to sort of talk bilaterally or engage bilaterally, very keen and eager to do so. But let me stop here, just given the time constraint.
Thank you so much, Joel, for giving this introduction to your CD program. I think it will spark the interest of many SAIs, and I'm very glad that you said that SAIs can actually reach out to you to learn more and also to see how to engage. You are starting the rollout of this, and I think there is potential for more interaction bilaterally here. So that's really good, and I think this has been an eye-opener also for many SAIs on how they can work with the IMF, and also with this experience from those SAIs have been undertaking emergency financing audits already to see, you know, like how to bring out the best and how to use IMF as a partner in the best way possible. So I think this is a really good opportunity, and so thank you again. And as a last intervention today, we are just up on the hour now, but I think one thing that could be very useful for us to take with us going forward is those resources, those COVID-related resources that the GAO has been a front runner in providing for INTOSAI. And that's why I just want to give Mike Hicks, the Director of International Relations in GAO, 2 minutes at the end here to just present very briefly some of those resources, because they are very much related to what we've been talking about today. It's about support during COVID to SAIs, and it's also about addressing fraud in audits. So please go ahead, Mike.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Now you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Yeah, I will be very brief. It's great to join all of you today, and I appreciate the opportunity. I just wanted to mention two things very briefly. First, as the COVID crisis unfolded, we helped establish an INTOSAI grant program working with you at IDI, and the INTOSAI Policy, Finance, and Administration Committee, and the INTOSAI General Secretariat to provide funding to SAIs to help with their continuity of operations. When the pandemic emerged, we learned that perhaps half of SAIs were not able to quickly adapt to remote work or maintain continuity of operations. So working with the parties I mentioned, we quickly set up a grant program with about 700,000 euro in INTOSAI funds that we redirected to assist SAIs with the acquisition of information technology and protective equipment. So from October 2020 through August 2021, we awarded 54 grants, which equals about 1/4 of INTOSAI's membership, and that totaled about 620,000 euros. And those funds were used to procure laptops, internet connectivity, and personal protective equipment. We've already seen very positive effects from this spending. I also want to mention that SAI Saudi Arabia has administered a separate continuity of operations grant program within ASOSAI, and they've distributed about 670,000 US dollars in the ASOSAI region. And actually the ASOSAI Secretariat has also awarded about $200,000 in grants to help 14 SAIs in that region. And then I'll just briefly mention that GAO has hosted 2 international webinars, and both are available online. The first one focused on best practices in real-time auditing, and the second one focused on ways that we can address fraud and anti-corruption in conducting oversight of COVID spending. So I'll just stop there, Camilla. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you briefly today.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for your patience and also for being brief there. I'm sure that many people are excited to kind of access your website and learn more about those offers that you can get there and the support. So, and it's a great achievement within INTOSAI to have put up such a website, and I think it's been a very helpful resource, as we also talked about during the coordination session on Friday. So thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I think we have to end off now, but so thank you so much, Emmanuel, Joel, Shafiq, Jostein, Gerald, Kamba, Martin, and Mike. I think I've mentioned everyone. I really hope so. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being with us more than 2 hours. I hope you learned a lot. And I'll just hand over to Brynja now for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Camilla. I'll be very, very brief. There's been some excellent examples of the importance and processes around audits, emergency funding, and the number of challenges have been highlighted, together with lots of good work that's being done in the SAIs. But clearly, I think there are obvious benefits of bringing SAIs and IMF closer together. I think early and ongoing dialogue between the IMF and SAIs is one thing that will be very valuable. Finally, I just want to say that here at the IDI, we look forward to working with IMF also and SAIs going forward. And one of the things that we will be focusing on is as mentioned by on the paper, that the joint paper that's been published, is to work together on looking at the role of SAIs in fighting corruption. So with that, I'll just want to again thank everyone for participating, and panelists, and not least Camilla for moderating in an excellent way. So thanks again, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
You mean on 2 dimensions. But if we were involved on the onset, because every fund is subject to be audited by us.